Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. We shall start in a minute. Just to give us 1 minute to start. Thank you.
Recording in progress. I can.
Okay, welcome, Ambassador Mushira. I think we are good to go.
Okay.
Over to you. Over to you, Honorable Dr. Nanima.
Excellencies present, Honorable Member of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and Special Rapporteur on Education, and First Vice Chairperson of the Committee, Honorable Mushira, Honorable Members of the Committee who are present, members from UNICEF, the AU Office, regional and national representatives, members from civil society organizations, NGOs, representatives of government, academia, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of UNICEF and the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, I would like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon to commemorate this International Day to protect education against attack. The commemoration of this day is evidence of a close working relationship that the African Committee enjoys with UNICEF. At its core, ladies and gentlemen, this relationship seeks to engage various environments that the African child or the child in Africa finds himself or herself in. This ranges from peaceful environments to instances of armed conflict, tension, and strife, as well as environments of refuge and internal displacements. In all these environments, two critical matters often come to the fore. That is the need to address the challenge of children affected by armed conflict on one hand, and ensuring equal access to quality education in Africa. Some of the notable activities in this symbiotic working relationship include UNICEF support to the committee's presentations at the biannual Peace and Security Council sessions, through the provision of data on children in situations of conflict. A key take from this relationship is the need to continue enhancing and crafting ways, activities of improving the situation of the child. This is informed by the greatest realization that affected children are not a homogeneous group. Just a moment. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the specifics in the various challenges that these children face is a step in the right direction. For this cause, today we add voice to the commemoration of this day and direct the conversation towards the need for states in Africa to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration. The year 2020 has seen a large number of attacks on schools and various countries. The endorsement of this document will underscore political commitment to protect children, teachers, schools, and universities from the effects of armed conflict. It is hoped that tonight's commemoration will increase the awareness of states of attacks on education in Africa, build traction towards the creation of an alliance to protect education from attacks, and create momentum towards the 4th International Conference on the Safe Schools Declaration from 25th to 27th October in Abuja. We shall listen to the keynote speaker, the Special Rapporteur of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child on Education, followed by remarks from UNICEF's representative to the AU and UNECA. This will lead us to a general overview of education under attack in Africa by a senior child and protection officer from the committee. We shall then go into a panel discussion under the facilitation of Ms. Mariki Ripola and a Q&A with Dr. Musa. Thereafter, concluding remarks will bring the webinar to a close. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to inform you that we also have interpretation services from English to French, and you are at liberty to use them. Without further ado, join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, the first Vice Chairperson, Honorable Member of the Committee and Special Rapporteur on Education, Honorable Mushira Khatab. Honorable Mushira, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Honorable Nanima. Good afternoon, everybody. With the protocol observed and for the sake of the time, I will go straight to the subject matter. As the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, I'm proud of our partnership with UNICEF. And I'm grateful for giving me this opportunity this afternoon. Unlike the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child starts not with the definition of the child, but rather with the obligation of states to implement the rights of the child. Our meeting today is not a celebration of the protection of education from attack. It's rather to renew our resolve and commitment, that of states and other key stakeholders to protect education and endorse the Safe Schools Declaration. This declaration calls for stopping attacks on schools, education facilities, and personnel. Our meeting today is to strengthen our resolve to implement a very critical human right, the right to education. It is not only an intrinsic human right, but also an enabler to the enjoyment of all human rights. As a matter of fact, it is a lifesaver. The timing of our meeting could not be more critical. COVID-19 has dealt a heavy blow. It's actually yet another hefty blow to our gains. And this calls for stronger resolve, and I am sure that all our partners will not spare any effort. For a host of other reasons, attack on education has intensified even more. Girls are still kidnapped while walking to schools. African states are short of the means to deal with mercenaries and warlords. Regional cooperation is not enough, and international cooperation is indispensable, and this is actually the cornerstone of my intervention. I would like to say that safeguarding the right to education requires conflict resolution, peacekeeping, peace building, and post-conflict nation building. Dealing with criminal organization requires solid international cooperation, and I underline solid and transparent international cooperation. It could not be left to Africa alone. The global community must put its hands together. It cannot remain silent. The United Nations Security Council must live up to its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. The Council must be proactive in implementing its mandate under Resolution 1612 to protect children affected by armed conflict and all forms of attacks. The Council needs to implement the 1612 action plan more vigorously and more seriously. We all know that, unfortunately, the performance of the Security Council was disappointing in dealing with COVID-19, and there are many lessons learned. Again, the international community cannot remain silent. Around the world, attacks on children continue unabated, as warring parties flout one of the most basic rules of war, that is the protection of children. The protracted nature of conflicts today is affecting the future of entire generations of children. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I say that attacks against schools and military use of school buildings are a grave violation of children's rights. The use of schools by armed forces, including as military bases, barracks, firing positions, or munitions caches, may turn them into military objectives and thus render them lawful targets of attack during times of armed conflict, and it must stop. We also must remember that education can provide safe spaces and is crucial to the success of other interventions, such as water and health. Apart from missing out on education, out-of-school children are more vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, and recruitment by armed forces. Schools provide a safe haven where children can be protected from these threats. The Safe School Declaration is an important commitment, but it must be ensured that states follow through with their commitments so that no child is deprived of their rights and childhood. Together, Mr. Chairman and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we must ensure that children learn despite conflict and insecurity. This requires partnership between states, CSOs, young people and children in order to protect students, teachers, schools, and universities from the worst effects of armed conflict. And as the world fights to contain COVID-19 pandemic, children and youth in conflict zones remain among the most vulnerable to its devastating impact. We must ensure our children have a safe and secure environment in which to learn the knowledge and skill they need for the future. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Honorable Mushira, for those insightful comments and the key take that we need a stronger resolve not to spare our efforts in ensuring that we protect education from attack. Without further ado, I'll invite the UN UNICEF representative to the AU office and UNECA to give his opening remarks. Dr. Edward Adai, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Honorable Dr. Nanima, and for the opportunity to join you on this platform to share a few words. Thank you, Honorable Ambassador Mushira, for your wise words and your call to action, in particular that attacks against schools is an attack to our education and our human rights, and it must stop. Thank you for the opportunity to join you on this platform as well. The distinguished partners, ladies and gentlemen, let me rest on all existing protocols to bring you greetings from Addis Ababa. I'd like to start by thanking you, Honorable Nanima and Honorable Mushira, and through you to the Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, as well as all our partners for coming together around this important issue linked to protection of education from attack. It's an urgent issue, and I think, Honorable Mushira, you have clearly articulated the urgency and the need for action and the need for international cooperation around this particular important issue. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, schools are more than just brick and mortar. Schools are central to the cognitive development of the child and the entire society. They are spaces for learning, spaces for research, spaces for reflection, but more importantly, spaces for creation. Like families, schools play a unique role in reproducing human society by providing the space and conditions for innovation and for change. Without schools, societies have to begin from scratch each time. And unfortunately, as we attack schools, other societies develop. An attack on schools and education is therefore an attack on our development. And it's also an attack on our freedom to think and to act. It's an attack on emancipation. A society that fails to protect its schools is sentenced and indeed doomed to a vicious and intergenerational cycle of poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. According to the 2020 Education Under Attack report, between 2015 and 2019, there were over 11,000 attacks on schools globally, and this is indeed an understatement, with over 1,000 attacks in Africa. These attacks, as you heard from Honorable Mushira, included military use of education facilities, attacks on children going to school, especially girls, attacks by non-state armed groups, excessive use of force by police against student protesters, and harming over 22,000 students and personnel. All these attacks on education have one thing in common. They prevent our children and young people from learning and from growing in a safe and nurturing environment. They deprive children and young people of their potential and of their future and undermine the growth and development of our continent. Attack on education is a great violation of human rights. It violates the right to education, as well as the right to life, liberty, and security of person, among other rights. And I join Honorable Mushira in saying this must stop. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a duty to make it safe for our children to go to school and to learn. We have a responsibility to stop the attacks on education and reverse this vicious cycle of poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment that we are experiencing in communities and countries on our continent. Practical and essential action for operationalizing and accelerating the implementation of this framework. In particular, I'm hoping that we'll use this platform to address a number of questions, in addition to the issues that Honorable Mushira has raised. The first is, why are schools in Africa still under attack in this 21st century? Second, what are the mental models, incentives, and drivers of this phenomenon? What makes our people attack the schools in their communities? Third, how can we prevent and respond promptly to this phenomenon? Fourth, what are our core commitments to children whose educations have been disrupted, including how do we deal with the learning poverty that these children experience, as well as the physical and psychological effects of attacks on schools, as well as holding perpetrators accountable? And five, how do we build back better? How do we build back our communities in a way that ensures that this phenomenon does not happen, and that schools and communities are safe spaces for our children to grow? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm hoping that within the context of the AU initiative to silence the guns, we will recommit to end attacks on schools as we reimagine an Africa where children are safe to learn and grow. Let me conclude by reaffirming UNICEF's readiness and availability to work with all of you, especially the African Committee of Experts and our governments, in ensuring that education is protected from attack. I thank you for your attention and wish all of us fruitful deliberations.
Thank Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can, but there was no sound.
Apologies. At this juncture, you allow me hand over to Ms. Mariki to take us through the next session of the program. Ms. Mariki, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Dr. Nanima. And thank you very much for this inspiring, welcoming remarks and keynote speech. that set the tone for the commemoration that we have today. My name is Marek Repola, and I am the Humanitarian Child Protection Officer at the UNICEF Office to the African Union and ECA. I'll be facilitating the next two sections of our agenda today. And first of all, we shall have a general overview of education under attack in Africa by Dr. Musavengana Chipwana from the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. This will be then followed by a panel discussion, digging a little bit deeper into the topic. And after this, we shall also open the floor for questions from the audience. But first, let me give the floor to Dr. Chipwana to lead us to have an overview of education under attack on our continent.
Thank you, Mariki, for this. I recognize Honorable Mushira, the first Vice President of the committee. I recognize my special rapporteur, Honorable Dr. Robert Nanima. I recognize also Dr. Eddie, other excellencies here present, colleagues and friends. It's just a brief presentation. I think most of the substantive content, Honorable Mushira has already touched on it, as well as Honorable Robert, as well as Dr. Robert. So I'm just going to flash some slides. Then, like what Marik mentioned, we will then go through a panel. So as always, we're going to start with our vision from the committee. In our strategic plan as well as in Agenda 2040. What is the vision? The vision is an Africa that is fit for children. So we need to reflect on this vision pertaining to the issue that we're dealing with. I would not call this a commemoration of the day. It would be a commiseration of these days because we are crying about the lost opportunities, the windows of opportunity that our children would not have. Then I'm going to unpack what is attacks on education. And I think the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack has done a good job in this regard, and they've been keeping us abreast with what has been happening through their research. And I noticed that Apolloni, I hope I said your name right, is on the call. I also recognize that the special representative of the Secretary General on children and armed conflict, they have been collecting data on attacks on schools because it is a trigger violation amongst the 6 grave violations, like Honorable Mushira has already mentioned. So let me start with the vision. Our starting point always is an Africa that is fit for children. Certainly, we will be in agreement if we say that when schools are attacked, it's not fostering an Africa that is fit for children. And the subsequent impact of it is that we are not likely to have children who are fit for the envisioned Africa come 2063. So this is one pertinent issue that we have to put on the top of each agenda to make sure that if we want an Africa that is fit for children, we have to make sure that they access the necessary quality education in a free environment, space, and schools, so that they can be what Agenda 2063 envisages for them to be. So in front of you, I've put a slide where I've tried to connect the right to education for children to Agenda 2063, as well as to the vision that the African Union is running with at present. So at the center of it, I have put Article 11 of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. Of course, I could have put also the other complementary articles, such as in the CRC, but here, okay, allow me, because part of the mandate of the committee is to promote and protect the rights as enshrined in the Charter. So I will promote in this particular instance the Article 11 of the Charter, which says, I'll just read Article 11, sub-article 1. It says, every child shall have the right to an education. Right there, we as I will show you in some of the statistics, that is not being realized. Every child shall have the right to educate. Every child. I think that's key. We're talking about a child with a disability. We're talking about the girl child, regardless of the cultural orientations of any community, regardless of any environmental prohibitions in any community. There must be a assurance that every child accesses quality education. And I've put education at the center of the realization of Agenda 2063, because the vision is to build an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa. And the seeds of a peaceful Africa are sown in the children today. The seeds for a peaceful Africa are not sown through the concept of child soldiers, I'll put that in quotes, are not sown through attacks on education, but the seeds for a peaceful and prosperous Africa are sown through the development of the child today. And also the vision is a prosperous and peaceful Africa, and Africa driven and managed by its own citizens. That's a problem already when those who are going to be managing it in 2063 henceforth, or even in the next 5 years or 10, are not equipped, are not given the opportunity to access the necessary skills. How then are we going to achieve this vision 2063? So there are 4 pillars out of the 7 in the Agenda 2063 that I've picked. At the top, I've put the pillar on a peaceful and secure Africa. There is no way we'll realize safe schools without a peaceful and secure Africa. There is no way also we're going to realize an Africa whose development is people-driven, when the people who are supposed to drive this agenda, who are supposed to drive this development, are being deprived of the right to education. That's problematic. So those are the 4 pillars. The other one is Africa as a strong, resilient, and influential global player. Who is Africa? Africa are the children. Africa are the people, are its people. And if the people are then not being able to access the necessary education, then they will not be able to become the players at the global level. And a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. How does this happen when the people who are supposed to drive the inclusive development are excluded from the education? So this is the challenge that we're dealing with at the normative level. We have cast an ambitious vision at the African Union level, and we have to put the nuts and bolts together. But before we do that, can we unpack attacks on education? Notice I'm saying attacks on education, not schools, because schools could be a minimalist way of looking at it. Education is broader. It's looking at the entire value chain, the entire system. But sometimes the attack, there's no grenade that has been thrown in a school, but there's still an attack on education because of other aspects, such as threats or the actual use of force against students, teachers, academics. Sometimes we forget some of these enablers for children to realize their right to education. There are a lot of enablers within the value chain of access to education, which need to be made to function well for children to realize quality education. So in this definition, I like this definition because it is trying to encapsulate all those enablers without necessarily focusing on the child alone. The teachers, the academics, the education support staff, education officials, including the infrastructure, the resources. And when these are facilities are being used for political, military, ideological, sectarian, and ethnic reasons, then that's an attack on education. So it's not only throwing a grenade in a school compound. It's not only using the classroom block to keep military equipment or to use the education infrastructure. It goes beyond that to look at the entire value chain of the education system. Attacks on education also take many other forms, including blocking students from accessing their education, their schools, deliberately or indiscriminately killing, maiming, and traumatizing students and education staff, destroying and damaging the infrastructure. So broadly, my submission through this slide was just for us to broaden the conversation to look at it beyond the hard infrastructure, which is the classroom, to looking at the entire value chain of access to education for the child. And if one aspect is not working well, it's likely to affect the entire ecosystem. And the inevitable outcomes, I think Honorable Mushira, as well as Dr. Eddy and Dr. Nanima have already spoken to this. There are a lot of, there's a domino effect to attacks on education. Certainly, the children will be deprived of their very right as enshrined in the instruments, like one that I've just read to you. But beyond that, the fatality can as well be the killing and injuring of the children. Certainly, there will be school dropouts because of fear, because the school would have lost its sanctity to be viewed as a place of safety where children can learn in harmony, to be a place that can expose children to several vulnerabilities like we have seen over time. So, because also we have seen that some armed groups have targeted schools for recruitment into their ranks, which is a problem in itself. I'll touch on it a little bit later. So, what are some of the trends that we have seen? I think the Central Sahel has been the place where there's been a lot of attacks on education, and more than 900 schools have been closed, and more than 150 students were forcibly displaced in Mali, whilst in Burkina Faso about 2,000 schools were closed in 2019. I want you to picture this. Let's assume each school has an enrollment of 500 students, just to be conservative, and 500 students multiplied by 2,000 schools. Already the numbers that we're dealing with are exponential of the children who are missing the opportunity to, most of them are coming from deprived communities, vulnerable communities, impoverished communities, and we all agree that education is a gateway to a better life, and that already has been deprived for the 326,152 students in 1 year. That's a concern. And if there's something that we can do about it, certainly this is an issue that requires urgency. The other aspect is in Burkina Faso also, 85 attacks on education in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger between January and July in 2020. And as Honorable Mushira mentioned, all this compounded with school closures because of the COVID-19, it makes the situation, it compounds the situation. Because when children are out of school, it presents itself with certain vulnerabilities. When children are out there, the girl child especially is prone to child marriages and so on. And the young people are prone to recruitment by armed groups, because those are the theaters of conflict. And now COVID-19 compounds the situation. And in Mali, again, I think I've spoken about Mali quite a bit. Non-state armed groups targeted state education across the Central Sahel. So we will find that the female students and educators are especially the ones that are targeted and affected. And I think according to the GCPEA report, I'll be showing you just now, that there has been an exponential increase on attacks on education and on school closures, especially in the Central Sahel, because also of the proliferation of non-state armed groups in that region. And so in front of you, I've put a map of the continent of Africa. Ignore the other parts. And this map is showing all those red spots. They are showing where there have been attacks on education. And I've also put in front of you some of the numbers, thanks to the GCPA report. The three most affected countries by this violation, by this grave violation, is Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sudan, followed by other countries such as Niger, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, Somalia, and so on. And what you can see here are lost opportunities. When I look at this slide, I see lost opportunities for young people to move out of poverty. I see vulnerability. I see young people who are not accessing school, who are then prone to other violations such as recruitment, such as child marriages, and so on, because there's been an attack on schools. I think these figures are disturbing. These figures are disturbing because they are showing us the schools. This is not number of children. These are the numbers of schools that have been closed, that have been verified to be closed. And then you calculate, using that conservative number of 500 students per school, what does that mean for Cameroon's future? What does that mean for the Democratic Republic of Congo's future? That's a concern. That's a concern. So why target schools by these the perpetrators? Relatively, because the state has abrogated its responsibility to provide a public good called security. Hence, you find that schools become an easy target where you find a lot of young people who can easily be abducted. The other reason also is that an attack on education, especially if you abduct children, it brings about media intensity on the coverage of the issue. And we need to focus on firming up on number one, to make sure that the schools have adequate security for the children, especially in the theaters of conflict. And the other reason is because it's ideological, because it is considered as a protestation against Western civilization. And I think here we can use the example of Boko Haram and what it means, a revolt against the Western civilization. So these are some of the reasons. This is not exhaustive, but these are some of the reasons why schools are targeted. But who are these people who are targeting the schools? You'll be interested to know that all actors apparently in the theaters of conflict are guilty of this. Non-state armed groups are the major perpetrators, granted, but also state security forces use schools for military purposes. And these are the people who are supposed to be ensuring security, but they are the ones who are also found culpable. Also, you find the Islamic militant groups who are ideologically oriented, the ethnic or religious-based militias are also, especially in the Central Sahel, are guilty of this. I'm concluding, Mariki. So what can be done? This is my last slide. This is not exhaustive, but certainly there has to be somebody to be held accountable. We cannot foster a culture of impunity and expect that the violations will disappear by themselves. There have to be prosecutions. We have seen, for example, in the context of the DRC, when there were prosecutions of militia leaders at the ICC or even at the national level, it has helped the country to create a culture of accountability. We need to have strong institutions that are able to conduct such prosecutions at country level. That's one of the problems that we're dealing with, to say, how do we ensure that we secure prosecutions for attacks on education? At least when we know that exists, we know also that there will be a possibility to have reparations. We need also to address underlying issues of inequality. Some of these conflicts in fact, most of them are a result of governance dynamics. So for us to address issues of attacks on education, we have to address the underlying issues, which are governance dynamics, issues where some groups of the populations feel undone by the state and they take it into their own hands. When the state is not able to meet its obligations for its citizenry, the citizenry will take it into their own hands to make sure that they get justice. State parties adhere to their obligations by making access to education safe free and of quality. I think the UN Security Council Resolution 1998 of 2011, as well as Resolution 1612 that Honorable Mushira spoke to, are very instructive at the UN level, because they make attacks on education to be a grave violation where a party can be listed because of this. And attacks also on education is captured in the African Charter, as well as the soft law that Honorable Robert spoke about of the Safe Schools Declaration. It's another instrument that we can use to make sure that all member states sign on to and commit to meet the obligations encapsulated therein, so that we can have an Africa that is fit for children, whilst we are creating children who are fit for the envisaged Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Musa, for giving us this excellent and very comprehensive overview on education under attack in Africa. Now, without further ado, I would like us to move on to the panel discussion. We have 4 esteemed experts in our panel today, and they have all 4 minutes to answer all of the questions we have for them. And after this, dear participants, if you have questions to any specific speaker, you may ask those, or if you have more general questions that any of the speakers may respond to, you're also welcome to raise these after the panel discussion. Now, we have just heard the overview of education under attack from Dr. Musa, and I'd like to ask our participants, our speakers, what are their reactions to this? Is this also what is the reality in the work they do? Are we seeing these events in different regions and different countries where you work? Let me start by giving the floor to Mr. Ifeanyi Ofodu Raymond, who is a youth activist from Nigeria. He also works as a consultant for the National Population Commission of Nigeria and Education Cannot Wait Fund. Overall, he's very passionate about achieving education for all and achieving the SDGs. Ifeanyi, please, what are your reflections to what you have just heard?
Thank you so much, Maraki. Thank you for this opportunity. And I must say that I am starting by pouring out my passion. I am so bitter, angry, and disappointed at the situation of things. Because when you look at this, these are the things that are in the past. We are still speaking about the present, and these attacks are still going on. When we come to the context of Nigeria, my country, it is terrible. As I'm speaking to you now, we have recorded cases of over 1,000 students who were attacked recently. And these attacks are still going on. The governor of Zamfara State, which is a state in my country, just closed down schools in a 21st century era. Why are we still talking about this now? So when we talk about attacks, we should leave the past. We are still in the present, and it's still happening in the present. And coming to the context of my work, I have increased my advocacy because I know that nobody is going to talk about this when you don't see it firsthand. Nobody is paying me for my advocacy works. Some of the humanitarian services I get other youths to do, nobody is paying for it. We do it because we have seen the pain in this. Have you ever imagined a child trekking in the bush for 7 hours because their child has been adopted? It is happening. Let us not think it is not there. It is happening. As I'm speaking to you, some children are in the bush. Nobody cares about their safety. Nobody cares about their well-being. So my reaction is more filled with furious, disappointed, and angry to this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very powerful remarks and sharing us what is the reality in Nigeria as well. Next, I would like to then move on to Mr. Cleophas Maragia, the Child Rights Advocacy Advisor at the African Union Liaison and Pan-Africa Office for Save the Children. He has over 11 years of experience working in emergency and development initiatives targeting children in Africa. Mr. Cleophas, over to you.
Thank you, everybody. Excellencies, all protocol observed. I identify really with a passionate statement about the situation of children in Nigeria and overall on the situation for children that are living in situations of armed conflict. Before I start, maybe I would like to share just a practical example. We are in the midst of a pandemic where children have stayed for a very long time out of school. And I know because my own kids got tired of staying with the adults in the house. I mean, after some time, children get bored and they want to go back to their colleagues in school where they are able to learn and play. And it's sad that in some instances, other children are going back to school and others cannot go back to school because their schools have been attacked. I try to put myself in the shoes of the child who cannot go back to school because the school was attacked, while the colleagues are going back to school and getting an education. And this is fostering inequality on the continent such that we have children that are able to fulfill their dreams and other children are not able to fulfill their dreams. So for me, it's a really emotional and painful subject. When we look at the attacks on schools, for example, the consequences go beyond what we see physically. A school has been bombed. We have abductions. We have children that are influence how they are going to live their lives for the rest of their lives. I know we have statistics about attacks on schools, about the children that have been affected. But when you look at the stories one by one, when you try to put faces to all these instances, then you find that these attacks are, first of all, disproportionately affecting girls. And we atrocities that are committed against females and
No sound.
Cleophas, we can't hear you. Probably an issue with the
Maybe if he stops the camera, the internet can be faster. Sometimes when you use the video, it affects the quality of the transmission.
Apologies. I hope you can hear me now.
We hear you now.
We do.
Yes, I think we had a power fluctuation in the office. Apologies for that. So as I was saying, when you look at these attacks on schools, we have girls and teachers that are female that are disproportionately targeted because of their sex. So we have other violations that come along, including abductions, rapes, and harassment. And this is very common, especially where we have non-state actors that are perpetrating this. For us, our reaction and the way we are working at the Africa Union Liaison Office for Save the Children, first of all, is to work towards laying out an accountability mechanism within the Africa Union for the ongoing attacks on schools. The AU Peace and Security Council has, of course, urged all member states to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration, which is an intergovernmental political commitment that is aimed at strengthening the prevention of and response to attacks on education during armed conflict. And some of the ways, of course, this can be done is by collecting reliable data on attacks and military use of schools, providing assistance to victims of attacks, investigating, and I think this is something that Dr. Musa has really talked about. Perpetrators need to be brought to account. We've had so many attacks on schools, but we've not had as many perpetrators being brought to account. And then, of course, developing and promoting conflict-sensitive approaches to education, seeking to continue education during armed conflict, and restricting the use of schools and universities for military purposes. We are also trying to ensure that all actors are brought on board and that the issue of children affected by armed conflict is kept on the agenda of the Africa Union. And recently, we had the successful launch of the Africa Platform on Children Affected by Armed Conflict, which is to essentially bring together member states, UN agencies, regional economic communities, and various other actors to make sure that we keep the issue of children affected by armed conflict on the agenda of the Africa Union. But overall, addressing some of the issues that Dr. Eddie pointed out, I think this is an opportunity for us to really have a sober conversation about why we are having schools attacked in the 21st century. Why are we having an instance where children are made to pay for something that they are not party to? Children are not party to the conflicts. Children are not part of these conflicts in any instance whatsoever, but they are taking the brunt of this, and it's probably affecting them for the rest of their lives and affecting their development. So for us, we as an organization, we want to urge everybody from the member states to the Africa Union organs, civil society organizations, to enhance the various partnerships that we have so that we make sure that attacks on schools are something that is back in history and not something that is happening in the current circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these reflections. Next, I would like to ask Ms. Cecilia Balde, UNICEF Regional Education Advisor for Western Central Africa, to take the floor. She has more than 30 years of experience in education policy and systems reforms in 8 African countries, and she has worked both in humanitarian and development contexts. Cecilia, what are your reactions to the presentation we have just received from Musa, and to continue the question that Cleophas also brought up from Eddie's remarks, why do you think these attacks are still so widespread on our continent?
You are muted. You are muted.
Cecilia, are you there?
Okay, thank you so much. Excuse me, I didn't realize I was muted. I started talking to myself. Just 2 or 3 points to add to what Dr. Chibwana has presented, as well as what previous speakers have said. Perhaps the first thing to say is that it is a sad reality across Western Central Africa that we have a situation on hand that doesn't seem to change. Secondly, that if you look at the situation across the region, even though we've seen the numbers that Dr. Chibwana has raised, we know that there are many, many more schools that are being attacked on a day-to-day basis. But if you look at in terms of the verification of such attacks, we have the UN monitoring and reporting mechanism that is supposed to be able to verify such attacks. In the past 5 years, we've had only 1,156 attacks on schools that have been verified. Last year alone, we only had 278 attacks verified by the UN through the MRM. And we know, obviously, that there are a lot more attacks on schools, and it is important that we have systems in place that make it possible for us to verify, because if we're talking about prosecutions of perpetrators of these attacks, you want to be able to establish factual data. So the problem around the monitoring mechanism needs to be looked at in order to be sure to be able to actually have the data. Having said that, we look at the question of attacks from a broader perspective of the multiple vulnerabilities that are affecting children in this region, in Western Central Africa. In the entire world, 2 out of every 5 children who are out of school are found in Western Central Africa. As we speak, we're talking about 40 million children, close to 40 million children who are out of school. And that includes around 12 million children who are out of school in the Sahel. So what we have is a crisis situation that actually is, the problems are so huge that you begin to wonder where we should actually now be going in terms of really addressing the root causes of the conflict that children face. So I think there are issues that we need to face. Dr. Chibwana talked about the fear that children are facing. Recently, we've had the opportunity to do some analysis, some secondary data analysis of the multiple indicators cluster survey, and we were looking at issues around disability. And what we seem to see in quite a few of our countries, especially in the Sahel, in West and Central Africa, is the increased levels of anxiety and depression among children. What are we going to do about these issues that are emerging among children? And not to talk of even the broader consequences beyond learning into the wider community, the consequences on the social and economic well-being of their families. I think the issues around attacks on children actually, unfortunately, go way beyond children, and they require a much more robust approach to addressing the challenges than what we are currently doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these reflections. Then I would like to invite Ms. Apolline Montoya, the Advocacy Officer at the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. She supports the coalition's advocacy related to the endorsement and implementation of the Safe School Declaration and the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during an armed conflict. Ms. Apolline, over to you.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to speak to you on behalf of the Global Coalition to Protect Education on this special day to mark the observance of the Second International Day to Protect Education from Attack. GCPA's general research has found that attacks on education have persisted during the pandemic and that vacant schools have been used for military purposes around the world. In 2020 alone, GCPA identified more than 2,400 reported incidents of attacks on education. Excuse me, I'm hearing a background noise.
Yes, dear participants, please mute yourselves.
Thank you. So in 2020 alone, GCPA identified more than 2,400 reported incidents of attacks on education and military use of schools and universities, a 33% increase over the preceding year. Zooming in on the African continent, we find that attacks on schools and universities, as well as their military use, are on the rise. In our latest report, Education Under Attack 2020, GCPA identified 18 African Union countries with a systematic pattern of attack on education. Our reports demonstrate that armed violence is on the rise in several African countries, including Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and the DRC. This, sadly, has led to a spike in attacks on education. In many cases, armed groups oppose state-sponsored education and deliberately attack its institutions or abduct or threaten students and teachers. The DRC was the most affected country globally between 2015 and 2019, and again in 2020, with over 500 reported attacks on education in 2020 alone. During that same year, in Nigeria, we reported over 400 students or education personnel harmed and over 230 educators threatened or attacked by armed groups in Burkina Faso. These alarming figures speak for themselves and illustrate a worrying picture with systematic patterns of attacks on education. However, it's important to note that this is not the whole story. With more than half the membership of the African Union having endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration, most recently by Togo and Senegal, many states in the region have demonstrated concrete actions to prevent and address attacks on education. In fact, GCPA research has previously found that the overall reported incidence of military use of schools and universities declined between 2015 and 2018 in 8 African countries that endorsed the declaration in 2015 and had experienced at least one reported incident of military use during that same period. I'm sure we will get into more details during the program, but I also want to highlight here the leadership role of the African Union. The declaration commitments have been translated into binding African Union peace and security decisions on attack on schools. The principles of the declaration are further included in the AU Doctrine on Peace Support Operations, adopted in January 2021, which directly refers to the central commitment of the SSD, namely, to ensure that schools are not attacked and used for military purposes. This is an important milestone, which reflects a growing consensus within the African continent on the importance of protecting schools from attack and military use. And just a few days ago, on September 6th, the Nigerian government released a new national policy for the safety of schools. The release of this policy comes at a time when Nigeria will soon be hosting the 4th International Conference on the Safe Schools Declaration from the 25th to the 27th October of this year. This is the first SSD conference to be held on the African continent and in a country and region that is severely affected by attacks on education. As such, the experiences of Nigeria and the Sahel region in addressing attacks on education will be particularly highlighted during the conference. I take this opportunity to encourage all participants here today to register for the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these reflections and also sharing about the conference that's coming up in Nigeria just next month. We have now finished the first round, and we have heard that education is unfortunately still widely under attack in many parts of the continent. And next, I would like to continue discussing a bit of the tools that we have in our disposal to protect education from attack. And many of you have already been mentioning the Safe School Declaration. That is an intergovernmental and political agreement that outlines the commitments to protect education from attack. Now, currently, we have 111 states that have endorsed the Safe School Declaration since 2015. And next, I would like us to reflect upon, since we are having yet again these attacks, what is working well when it comes to the implementation of the Safe School Declaration now that we are some 6 years into its existence. And if you would also like to reflect upon how this declaration complements the Charter, the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, that is also a crucial instrument here in Africa. So you're welcome to do that as well. But please, Apolline, I could maybe actually continue with you, since you were also talking quite extensively about the Safe School Declaration. So what is working particularly well, and what other tools, if any, do we have in our disposal?
Thank you. So I will continue then. So while attacks on education have persisted under the pandemic and demonstrated again the vulnerabilities of vacant schools being used for military purposes, recent good practice has also demonstrated the value of the Safe Schools Declaration in protecting schools from attacks and military use. In the last 6 years, over a dozen countries have revised their national policies and practices, or their military manuals, to reduce military use of educational facilities. For example, last year, the Central African Republic criminalized attacks on schools and occupation of schools in its Child Protection Code. Mali has also done a lot in terms of implementation. They've established a national action plan and capacity building with community mobilization, which is now guiding implementation on the ground. And we look forward to the adoption of the draft bill on the protection of education from attacks. In May of last year, in Burkina Faso, the Minister of Education also announced that distance learning introduced due to COVID-19 would extend to students affected by conflict, in line with SSD commitment for the continuity of education in times of war. And on accountability, Kenya has also made a lot of progress. In 2019, 4 years after the Al-Shabaab gunmen stormed Garissa University College, a Kenyan court convicted 3 men who were accused of crimes in connection with the deadly attack. One of the key commitments of the declaration is also to support the effort of the UN Security Council on Children in Armed Conflict and the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict and other related UN organs. Once again, on that front, we've seen a lot of progress. Most recently, during the Security Council, the government of Niger championed a landmark presidential statement on attacks on schools in September 2020. So as you can see, there are several examples of good practice that has demonstrated the value of the SSD and demonstrate that it does work and can be implemented at the national level according to each country's particular context, priorities, capacity, and policies. Now, turning to the other part of that question, the SSD indeed complements the Charter in multiple ways. Affirming this, the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child included the issue of attacks on education and the SSD in its recently adopted General Comment on Children in Situation of Conflict. Several articles, including Article 11, as we've seen, on education, as well as Article 27 on the protection of women and girls, also have a direct bearing and relation to the safeguarding of education. The declaration therefore serves as a concrete tool to implement and strengthen existing obligations under the Charter, as well as other international human rights treaties obligations, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, its optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, as well as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Therefore, the SSD truly complements the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and as such, I encourage all African Union countries that have not done so yet to endorse the declaration in advance of the Abuja conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cleophas, may I continue with you next? We all know that Save the Children is spearheading the implementation of the Safe School Declaration as well. What are your reflections? What is working well?
All right, thank you for that. I think, in my opinion, the first thing that we need to look at, of course, we need to look at the positive side of it. 6 years into the existence of the declaration, over half of the African Union member states have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration. So that's, for me, a really positive step, also considering that conflict situations are sensitive issues for member states. So having more than half of the member states endorsing the Safe Schools Declaration is definitely in the right step. We also know that there are a number of discussions ongoing with quite a number of member states for them to be able to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration. So for me, that is the first step. But in terms of endorsement and then implementation and reporting now becomes the next big aspect. We don't want to get ourselves into a situation where countries have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration, but we don't have a platform or a willingness or the political commitment to be able to domesticate this, to implement as well as to report. So for me, one of the key things that we really need to focus on is looking at how member states are implementing the declaration, monitoring and reporting on the same. So for me, that's the first aspect. The second aspect is now how all this intersects with the work of the African Committee, especially in the context, of course, of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. I think Dr. Musa also alluded to this in his presentation, and this has come out throughout. Article 22 of the Charter is meant to ensure that children benefit from the rights, protection, and care that they're entitled to in the context of armed conflict and in accordance with international humanitarian law. So this is quite clear. The Charter is very clear in Article 42 as well, which is talking about states, states having state parties provided with the guidance and standards on how to deal with situations of armed conflict, tension, and strife on the continent. I know in September 2020, the committee finalized the general comment for Article 22. And this general comment took a lot of inspiration from the Safe Schools Declaration and guidelines. So we are seeing really concerted action that is centering in on the Safe Schools Declaration, and that is serving as a good source document in terms of protecting children in armed conflict situation. The committee also issued guidance recently on the protection of children during armed conflict and called on countries to either ban the use of schools for military purposes or at a minimum enact concrete measures to deter the use of schools for military purposes. Additionally, we also know that the African Union, I hope you can hear me. I can see in the chat box that my volume is low. Could be not a problem on my end. I hope you can hear me though. So the AU requires, yes, so the AU requires that countries contributing troops to its peace operations to ensure that schools are not attacked or used for military purposes. So for me, my reflection on the Safe Schools Declaration is that, of course, we are happy that a lot of countries have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration. The fact that the continent, the African continent, remains the continent where a lot of children are affected in conflict situations, for me, should be reason enough to have all the countries on the continent endorsing this. And we should have a push towards implementation and reporting of the guideline implementation. So, I mean, it's a positive thing. Various countries, we should share experiences across the board in terms of the various countries that have been able to implement, but we need concerted action at all levels to make sure that all countries adopt this, adopt the declaration first of all, and that there is a framework to ensure its proper implementation and reporting, because I feel 6 years is a long time to go through these processes. If we are going to spend another 5-6 years just to get all the countries on board, then there are a lot of children that are going to be left behind. That would be my reflection on the SSD, as well as how it intersects with the work of the African Committee of Experts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive reflections. I'll then move on to Cecilia. How do you see the successes of the implementation of the declaration in your region so far?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Marike. I would raise a couple of points concerning the successes and where we are. One is that I think the Safe Schools framework has actually given us the opportunity to synergize better across multiple sectors, particularly between education and child protection, to help us to better harmonize and align and integrate our responses. Increasingly, you see countries adopting more kind of holistic multisectoral approaches, using schools as platforms for integrated programming that brings together learning and safety alongside other interventions such as in health, in water, in nutrition, and in psychosocial well-being. But also, I think it's important to say that because we have other complementary programming frameworks, they come in as a complement to the Safe Schools framework. And by that, I'm talking about the linkages between Safe Schools and Safe to Learn initiatives that we work with. And I think the more we can actually bring these complementary frameworks together, to align them, to work in a way that really helps us to reap optimal benefits, the better it would be in terms of efficiency and effectiveness in achieving safety and learning outcomes. So that is a plus in terms of the way in which the programming is happening. Maybe just one third point is to say that what UNICEF has done in the past few years is really to really explore the possibility of strengthening our approaches, programming approaches in humanitarian settings. And by that, I'm talking specifically about the risk-informed approach to programming, which really calls into question the need to look at the root causes of conflict and insecurity. and the need to integrate responses systematically within education sector policies and plans, so that we don't wait until some of these challenges surface before we can begin to integrate responses that are not just immediate responses to a given attack, but also more long-term solutions to the problems. Because what we see is that the actions at service delivery level, or even to some extent the capacity development work, these actions are not necessarily stopping the continuing attacks on children. And so then we ask the question then, in the context of a humanitarian response, should we just continue to just limit our guidance to the principle of do no harm alone? Or do we look more comprehensively at the other principles, such as the principle of doing more good, or investing, for example, in peace education in a much more comprehensive way than what is going on? I think that it is important that we also look at the political dimensions of efforts to address the root causes of conflict. Because when we listen to people speak, we hear about political commitment in signing the declaration. But how do you go from political commitment to political action? And the questions that arise in that context revolve around the question that one of the speakers has already raised in terms of what is the place of the international community in terms of mobilizing political leaders to do things differently, in terms of looking at how to find those political spaces for constructive engagement across all divides, across, among all parties to the conflict. Because this is really, at the end of the day, this is the crux of the matter. This is the elephant in the room. Because for as long as we continue to operate at a superficial level without addressing the root causes of the conflict, the governance issues, the interethnic differences, somebody talked about inequalities, systemic inequalities that have gone on for years on end, we cannot see traction in just signing the political the declaration. We have to go from signing the declaration to action, and that action requires engagements at the level of the political level, internationally, at the level of all state parties to a given conflict, and at the level of the community level, where we can see possible entry points for prevention of conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for this very powerful speech. Now, lastly, I would like to turn to Ife Anui. We have heard quite a few speakers also mention Nigeria already. So how do you see what is working well when it comes to the Safe School Declaration implementation in Nigeria?
Thank you, Maraki. One thing I promised myself is that everything I'm going to say in this place is fact. I'm going to tell you actual facts of what is working, what is seen at the grassroots level. You know, when it comes to the Safe Schools Declaration, the only thing I can see working is the high-level commitment, which is, yes, it has been known that this is a problem. It has been identified by the political party that this is a problem. But has it been identified to the schools, to the communities, to the grassroots level? So when we come to the Safe School Declaration, we can only say that what is working well is that, yes, it has been put into a framework. It has been called a problem. It has been identified as a problem, and that is a stepping stone. Because when something is identified, then we look for the solution. Sorry to say, I've not really seen solution because it seemed. Because when we look at the political commitment, after they come to the summit, political parties declare whatever and what they feel that they can do. They just say, yes, yes, we do this, we commit, just because they are in the international arena, they are in the international conference. But when they go back home, what do? Do they keep moving funds for the purpose of the declaration, or do they get to other levels of things? So as a youth at my community and as a youth at my local government area, I think that the state school declaration is just on the high level. It has not come down to the grassroots, which is the major purpose of the state school declaration. It is meant to come down. It is not meant to be at the top. So the only thing that I can identify that the state school declaration has done is to make out a framework for it. It has been identified. So this is where I will stop on what I've seen the state school declaration has done, because everything we need to say here needs to be the truth and the fact, so that we can know what the problem really is. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and already taking us to the grassroots level and giving us the reality from the ground. Very grateful. I think my next question was indeed related to what is not working so well when it comes to implementation of the Safe School Declaration. But I think all of you speakers have already moved there and shared with us your different views on that. So I would like to continue on that theme, but also link it more in generally what Dr. Adai was raising earlier in his remarks. And he was asking now that on top of course, in some parts increasing attacks against education, we also have had the lockdowns because of COVID-19. And now we do have the chance to build back better and include the communities in this work as well. So I'd really like to hear your reflections on how do we do that? How do we use the Safe School Declaration and in general ensure that we indeed build back better and make education safe for all? Cleophas, may I start with you?
All right. Thank you for that. I think, first of all, I have to agree that the Safe Schools Declaration, as the previous speaker has indicated, it can be a bit frustrating to have a policy that is well known and at the continental level, but we don't see the results at the grassroots level. And I think I agree, because children, I would say, don't live at that high level. We live in our villages, we live in our towns, we live in our cities, we live in where we live. We need to see this action trickle down. But then in terms of building back better, so mostly this is around identifying how to overcome the various challenges to make sure that attacks on education stop and the effects that they have on children are no longer felt by the children. And I think one of the key things that has been raised today, and I will say it because we need to really stress on that, is that African Union member states and all parties to conflict on the continent must find consensual, meaningful, and sustainable ways of ending wars in the region. We wouldn't be having schools being attacked if we didn't have these conflicts to begin with. And these conflicts are always a manifestation of something going wrong with our society. I was having a conversation with a colleague, and we all agreed that if a society is equal and prosperous, nobody wants to get up and fight. Nobody wants to fight in an instance like that. But when we have a conflict, it's usually pointing to something going wrong within the society. And as long as this is not addressed, then we will always have these issues. And wars don't just affect education, they affect the economies, they have a domino effect throughout society. So we need to find a way really of making sure that all the wars in the region, we need to silence the guns, we need to stop having these conflicts, because that is the only way we are going to move on from all this. And also, in those instances where we have conflicts, we need to recognize that children must be protected. We have, member states have signed on to various instruments, the African Charter, the CRC, so many international instruments. Some of them have been domesticated, but the moment a country goes into a conflict situation, it seems as though we throw all of those things outside the window. We need to remember, and I think this is also, of course, a reiteration of the responsibilities of the various bodies. So we are talking about the African Committee, or the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and all the other treaty bodies that are tasked with the implementation and monitoring of the same. We need to remind the state parties of their obligations under all these different instruments, so that when we have an armed conflict, it doesn't mean that we suspend our adherence to these various instruments. We also wish to, of course, call upon the AU Commission to fast track the establishment of a comprehensive child protection architecture within the AU Commission, and something that we've really been pushing for, the appointment of an AU Special Envoy for children affected by armed conflict in Africa. It's good to have individuals like this, officers like this, so that we are able to follow up on these issues and make sure that we have the relevant data and that action is taken against perpetrators. Another aspect, of course, that I've alluded to that, again, we need to insist upon. We may have all these agreements and we want to come to consensus, but there will ultimately be perpetrators violating children within armed conflict contexts. We need to make sure that these are investigated and that the perpetrators are brought to justice. We have seen in many instances where conflicts are taking on a political undertone, for example, that nothing comes out of the investigations. It's assumed that the country was undergoing, for example, some form of a political revolution or something, and all those atrocities are swept under the carpet under the guise of we need to come together and move on. And I think it's negative because it gives the opportunity in the future for people to abuse children, to perpetrate offenses against children, because they know they will not be held accountable. We've had quite a number of cases where we've had crimes against humanity, high-level cases being prosecuted. We want to see violations against children, specifically within armed conflict, also taking precedence, being investigated, and the perpetrators being brought to justice. We've spoken quite enough about the Safe Schools Declaration, having more member states endorsing and implementing, as well as having mechanisms towards reporting on the implementation at national, regional, and AU levels. So I'm not going to go into that, but just building up on what the speaker from Nigeria also alluded to. Through our monitoring of the implementation of the SSD, we need to look and make sure that the declaration and the guidelines are felt all the way down to where the children are. We don't want high-level commitments and then no follow-up on the same. So for me, that would be my reaction. I know we have a lot of challenges in terms of building back better, also looking at the fact that we have conflicts breaking out every other day on the continent. So you can be trying to fix one thing here and then, another one comes up. But overall, we do have good recommendations. We have best practices from various countries on how we can proceed with this. And I think if we all come together, we will be able to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to move to Cecilia.
I think the question you have raised concerning how we can build back better is a really important question. What we are doing these days is to use the opportunity of the COVID pandemic not to look at it from a negative perspective, but to look at it from the perspective of an opportunity to innovate and to renew our systems. So there's a lot that we are doing in the area of innovations for learning and innovations in building more equitable systems, especially looking at what is happening in many of our countries in the areas of investments in digital learning, in the areas of investment in helping to address the learning crisis from the bottom up, by dealing with the foundational learning competencies that children are not actually forming in the early years of their development. We increasingly see the need to accompany education systems, education as well as child protection systems, to be much more agile, much more adaptive to the prevailing circumstances, and much more kind of responsive and quick to action. We know that our education systems are very heavy. You know, the bureaucracies are really slow. And in this day and age, with the current situation where there are so many unknowns, you think that you have a solution today, tomorrow that solution is obsolete because of the changing circumstances of our lives. And therefore, for education systems to be more adapted to those circumstances, we need to be able to invest in preventive action. We need to be able to anticipate some of the bedrocks that actually, if we act on them, we can find more resilient approaches that can help us to respond to situations of emergency that arise. And that resilience requires that we look at things that we don't traditionally deal with. Things, for example, what is it that the children are learning that helps them to be more resilient? Just take one specific issue, for example. How much time do our education curricula invest, for example, on food security issues in the curriculum? How much time do we invest in skills that help build resilience of children? If you look at our curricula, a lot of what is offered is very theoretical. It is not skills oriented. It is just a transfer of content that is obsolete, and we need to make that shift. And if we look at governance systems in education, the decentralization policies, how they affect or even don't affect the participation of civil society in education. We have the us and them scenarios where policymakers see themselves as people who are the ones that must make all the decisions. How do we shift that? How do we shift to increasingly empower local communities to take charge of the education of their children, from defining what the children learn, to how they learn, to monitoring the difference that learning is doing in a given community. And my pet topic is on the financing of education these days. I cannot stop without saying something about that. On the financing of education, if you look at West and Central Africa, the greater majority of our countries are not even reaching that little 20% that the international community has put as a target for all countries. The majority of countries are not putting resources. If you look at how those resources are being spent, there's a total disconnect between the results that we see and the investments that are being made. And we need, therefore, to make some more serious investments in public finance management systems that help us to find the solutions that help us to do better with the little that we have. So building back better requires that we not only look at the systems, the education systems in their totality, but also look at the way in which we empower people along the way to take charge of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. I'll move next to Ifeanyi. How do you see and envision us building back better?
Okay, thank you very much. So I would say that the first step we took is number one, the declaration has been done. Okay, so now let us use this declaration to solve the problem. Let us look at the problem of accountability. In Nigeria, for example, when we talk about attacks on education, the federal government leaves it to the state. The state government said, oh, no, it's not us that is meant to do this. Let's say to the local government, the community, who is to be held accountable. Nobody wants to be blamed. I don't want to be blamed. You don't want to be blamed. Who should be blamed for the problems? So we need to distress that. We need to look at the problem of who is really in charge of protecting these educational problems. And I say it is to the government. The government is one, whether it is the local government, it is the state government, or the federal government. Government is government. And government should really look at equipping the local government communities, most especially these local government areas, letting them know that, yes, you are in charge of the local school educations. How do we help you? How do we protect you? How do we equip you to better protect the schools at your locality? It is the problem that we are facing at this junction. So how do we build that better? Let us better give accountability to who it is meant for. If it is at the local government, let us give them that. Let us give them that equipment. Let us give them that tools to make their schools secure, because most schools are located at the local government. And if the federal government say, yes, we have our own schools that are federal and we don't have any issues with the state and the local, who should be held accountable? The federal gives money to the state gives to the local government. So if the local government gets nothing, nothing can be done. So let us better start keeping this accountability at its own level. Let us not leave it to anyone. Let us all hold it together. The president, even if the attack happens in a school at the border, the president should hold responsibility, because he is in charge of protecting that school, no matter how little, no matter how high. Then secondly, I will look at the case of what we talk when we talk about the reporting and monitoring system of our schools. How do we even monitor? How do we even report cases? We report cases after 3 or 5 days when the attacks are done. How do we even get response systems? What are the trainings like for the staffs that work in the schools? What are the security guards? Have they been oriented on security issues, or are they just security guards for nothing? Can they even defend themselves when these attackers come to the gates of the schools? What do? Have we given them that orientation? Have we given them that monitoring mechanism? So what have we really done when it comes to empowering the local school authorities to better prepare for these harms? Have we given them the tools necessary to get them ready? The Safe School Declaration has done what? Brought out the commitment. Now let us decentralize this commitment. Let us bring it down. Let us look at these security guards, look at these principals, train them properly on how they should properly declare a safe school. Give them the tools that they can report immediately if there are dangers at hand. This aside, I'm looking at the case of introducing the technological system to Safe School Declaration. When we are talking about technology, when we are talking about artificial intelligence, how have you introduced it into the Safe School Declaration? We need to consider this because, one, when we talk about artificial intelligence, we are talking about new modern day tools to help schools adapt. How can the satellite system help us identify risk? How can it help us identify the problems at hand? We need to really consider all these possible means of solving these problems. What are our communication like? Are there internet in these grassroots levels to report cases of security when it comes? Or do we wait till it happens before we shout? What are we really ready for? Then now, another aspect of it is the student readiness programs. How ready is our students to these harms? Have we really told our students the truth? Have we told them that such dangers can come, what you should do and what you shouldn't do? How prepared are we? If we are not even prepared for harm, how do we solve the problem when it comes? That is why we keep on looking confused whenever there are problems of educational attack. So I really think that we should consider new innovative ways to make these problems happen and solve. So thank you very much. And this is what I have to say on the Building Back Better. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very practical suggestions as well. Last but definitely not least, over to you, Apolline.
Thank you. So I think that the biggest strength of the Safe Schools Declaration actually is that it provides concrete recommendations that states can implement according to their capacities, priorities, and context to build back better. I have mentioned several examples of good practice earlier, showing how states have taken the SSD commitments and recommendation and made it their own, domesticating these at the local level. But there are a lot more ways that the declaration can be used to protect education. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we recommended that states ensure that any back-to-school campaigns and catch-up classes include learners who previously ended their studies due to attacks on schools, insecurity, or displacement. We further recommended the expansion of inclusive distance learning programs established in response to the COVID-19 pandemic to benefit these learners. To build back better, we also recommend that states ensure access to quality, safe education for women and girls at all levels of education, given the vital role of education in eliminating gender inequality, as well as recommending to prioritize funding to prevent, mitigate, and respond to attacks on education by including risk assessment, contingency plans, and comprehensive safety and security plans. I think that in general, what needs to happen is a coordinated community, national, and global action. This question in many ways also relates to the initial question of what is not working. And I think that depending on which country, region, or specific context we're looking at, we could discuss various kinds of challenges in the implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration. I will only focus on three because of the time is running out. The first one, and it was mentioned countless times today, is obviously the lack of accountability. Unfortunately, we continue to see a major gap in ensuring adequate prosecution of cases of attacks on education. Sadly, national and international courts are only too rarely able to condemn attacks on education. What is needed to overcome this issue is for governments to empower justice processes to carry out their mandate independently to bring justice to the victims and survivors. Effective investigation of attacks on education, appropriately prosecuting all perpetrators, and providing appropriate remedial measures. And for this to be truly effective, as was mentioned a few times as well, we require systematic and comprehensive data collection on attacks of schools. Second, as we know, the continent suffers from attacks on schools and universities by non-state armed groups. This is a very complex problem, of course, but there are concrete measures that can be adopted to begin to address it. For instance, Geneva Call has developed specific deeds of commitments that non-state armed groups can sign to make particular commitments, including one that on the protection of children from the effect of armed conflict. States can encourage non-state armed groups to sign this deed and commit to the protection of education. The Special Rapporteur of the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict, Mrs. Virginia Gambas, is also working and has taken concrete steps to develop national action plans with these groups. These measures demonstrate that there are progresses that can be achieved in that front as well. And lastly, attacks by non-state armed groups constitute a regional problem rather than a national and isolated one. For instance, in the Sahel region. As such, it requires a regional response and greater regional cooperation. Again, on that front, we've seen progress on the continent, and we commend the regional efforts that are underway, such as the SSD Sahel platform, uniting Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger to address attacks on education. This is exactly the kind of initiative that is needed to ensure a common, coordinated, and comprehensive approach to attacks on education. And much more still remains to be done, of course, but I'm aware of the time, so I will stop here and encourage everyone to come and participate at the conference to hear more on what's been done to address this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Apolline, for this great reflections and also noting the time. Indeed, we are running a bit short of time, so I will now, I was going to ask the panelists to give final reflections, but maybe we will instead prioritize some questions from the floor. Thank you so much. Please do, speakers, stay there. We will now open the floor. I will give it to Dr. Musa to lead us to the question and answer. So hopefully, if you have time, dear participants, do also stay and ask questions if you do have them. Over to you, Musa.
Thank you, Mariki. Before I open the floor, if in case you do not have opportunity to take the floor, please may you type your question in the chat box because we are running out, and we seek your indulgence also to just extend up to quarter past 4, which means 20 minutes from now, so that we can do justice to the hands that I'm seeing that want to take the floor. But before I take the hands, I invite Dr. Eddie to give a few reflections. Then we'll have Dr. Dennis to give some 3 minutes reflections also from his experience to make sure that we have a robust discussion here. Dr. Eddie, quickly, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Musa, for the opportunity to come back. If it's okay, Dr. Musa, it might be great for us to hear from those who haven't spoken. And then I come in later, if it's okay with you, Dr. Musa.
By all means, I think we are fine. So, Dr. Dennis, you can take the floor. You have 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. As some of you may know, I represent Education International. Basically, I represent the teachers of Africa and of the world. As teachers, we have really suffered from attack. Our members have been attacked in the various countries that have been mentioned, whether you're talking about Nigeria, Cameroon, northern Mozambique, etc. It's a big problem. So both teachers and students are suffering. It's important to bear that in mind when we talk about protecting schools and other education institutions from attack. Let's not forget the educators. The second point I want to stress is that we have very good instruments. Of course, we want governments to adopt them, but adoption is not enough. The problem is actually action. There's a big gap between policy and practice. How do we shift from the good instruments, the good policies that we have, to concrete action on the ground so as to protect our education institutions from attack? That's the biggest challenge, particularly in Africa. I want to give you just 5 quick recommendations after having made those 2 important observations. First, schools and education institutions must be safe sanctuaries and protected from attack. That's an important message which should resonate across Africa and the world. Number 2, governments, the UN and its agencies, regional bodies such as the African Union should take concrete and immediate measures to protect schools and all education institutions, educators and students from attack. 3, urgent measures should be taken to rescue all the students and educators who have been kidnapped. These are human beings. They come from families. We should rescue them. Governments have the capacity to do that. Number 4, governments and partners should provide psychosocial support and other support mechanisms to victims of attack. And finally, number 5, governments and the UN should take legislative and concrete measures to promote and protect academic freedom and teacher professional autonomy. This is because quite often teachers are attacked for carrying out research, and sometimes they're expected to toe the line when teaching. That becomes a problem because teaching is based on science and evidence. So it's important to protect our educators and our students. Otherwise, as educators, as teachers from Africa and the world, we're in this together, and we look forward to more follow-up, more concrete follow-up actions after this meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Dennis, for the concrete recommendations that you have given, and for us to remember that, broadly speaking, when we're talking about attacks on education, we should not forget the educators. That has been driven home. I recognize Abubakar, Muazu, as well as Dorothy. So Abubakar first, then Dorothy. Please, you have 2 minutes to make your intervention. If it's a question, you may need to clarify to who. If it's a contribution, you're welcome. 2 minutes. Proceed, Abubakar.
Okay, thank you so much, Excellencies, honorable colleagues. I think it's quite great. I'm excited with the contribution made by the IFAI youth representative. Most importantly, with raising cases in Nigeria, particularly within the northeast and northwestern part of Nigeria, with so many attacks and many more. I think what we should be talking about now is the commitment from the subnational level, commitment from state level to look at how state government will domesticate the policy. It's not only to have the policy in place, but another way to also advocate and call on the domestication of such policy and implementation of the policy. So as we mark that, we call on our international partners, civil society organizations, and government, most importantly, policy makers and duty bearers within the executive and the legislative arm to see to the implementation of the policy across the school. If you look at the population across the Lake Chad region, being someone that comes from Borno State, particularly diversified by the Boko Haram insurgency, you get to see the increase in school dropout. The increase in school dropout from the population, the retention is not there. The enrollment, people are afraid to even enroll as a result of the massive kidnapping and abduction of students in the country. So it is important for us to start talking about this because it's not only Nigeria alone, but it will extend further within the West Africa region, particularly in the Lake Chad region, crossing around Chad, Niger, Cameroon, and other part of the countries. While in the Northwest as also, it's part of the Niger and many more. So it is important for us to look at it in a wider perspective, looking at it in the sub-regional level, looking at it in the continental level, and looking at it at how locals within grassroots communities get to understand what these policies are all about, how they can contribute their own part, how young people can advocate and continue to call on duty bearers and policymakers to implement this. The only way out is our ability to continue advocacy and many more. Thank you so much, and over to you, Mr. Musa.
All right. Thanks, Abubakar, for, I think the call you are making is for these policy commitments to be real, to be a lived reality for the children. I think that's also the call that the young person from Nigeria has been making all this while in Cleophas. So thank you so much. Dorothy, you have the floor, 2 minutes. If it's a question, please indicate to who. Does it mean there's not much appetite for asking questions? After Dorothy, I think we'll address a question that is in the chat box. Please remember to put questions in the chat box or contributions so that it enriches the conversation. Dorothy, you have the floor.
Thank you so very much for this opportunity to be part of this great program. I'm Dorothy from Cameroon. I have a question, but I put up my questions on the chat box. I don't know if I should just repeat the questions again.
Proceed. You have the floor already. Yeah.
Pardon me, sir.
Yes, you can proceed since you have the floor already. Yeah.
Yeah. The first question I asked was because in Cameroon where I live, we have a lot of we are facing crisis for the past 4 to 5 years now, and we have a lot of little children or children who they have run away from the crisis. They run away from their villages into the forest to to seek safety. And I'm asking, how do we integrate these children? How do we bring them? How do we cause them to benefit from what we are talking about? Because they are in the forest. How do we get to them? How do they benefit from all of this? That's my first question. And the other question I want to ask is concerning Dr. Musa said something concerning punitive measures on all perpetrators. But last year we observed that there is this school in my community as well, and most of these young girls who went to this school were actually, or they got pregnant in the school. They were actually, they had sexual relationships with some of the military men who were, they were placed at the security post of the school. And these girls do not, these people are deployed from time to time. They are not kept on a particular post for so long. They are kept for about 2 weeks, 1 month. And some of them got pregnant along the way, and there is no way to identify them. How do we punish such individuals? These are my 2 questions. Thank you so very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. Forgive me, Cecilia, I would want to put you on the spot. Pertaining to the first question around the programming that you are undertaking in your region, the question that Dorothy asked about how we can reach out to those who are in the forest who have run away from conflicts. I think this is about internal displacement of children. How do we respond to that? Then the second question, which is meant for me, I want to tap into the wealth of resources that we have here. Cleophas is here, I know he's smiling. Honorable Mushira is here also. Anyone wants to tackle that question before I make a last intervention, please indicate so that we tap into the wealth of resource that we have here. Honorable Mushira, we have the floor.
Thank you.
I see you.
I just want to say one sentence.
Yes,
I want to remind you of my call for international cooperation, because we need the Security Council, United Nations Security Council, to assume its responsibility. There are a set of resolutions in this field, and we need the big or superpowers to help us, because right now we've seen terrorism, violent extremism, mercenary groups, you name it. We say non-state actors. Actually, this gives them a prestigious status. But these are people who children go to school. These are people who use schools as stations to launch attacks. So we have to underline cooperation, UN Security Council, the UN in general. Of course, there is ongoing cooperation between the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in Geneva and our committee, and we're very satisfied, but it is not enough. And also the UN Secretary General Special Representative concern, be it violence against children or children affected by armed conflict, or we need to put our hands together, because this is a huge violation of the rights of the child. It's not only violation of the right to education, but to security, safety, protection from violence, you name it. Thank you very much. This has been a very productive meeting. I'm really proud to be part of it, and great thanks for everyone who contributed. Special thank you to UNICEF and the Secretariat of our committee and Honorable Robert Nanima. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency, for the intervention and for the vote of thanks. Cecilia, you have the floor. Then Cleophas and Ifeanyi.
Actually, I think Her Excellency has really put the finger on the pulse. Because when you have that kind of international response, it really goes to the structural causes of the problems that we are facing. Because when you want to deal with those structural causes, such as the problem of impunity, the problem of governance, the problem of social inequalities and injustice, these are things that you can't have impactful responses at the sectoral level. So for example, we can talk about reintegration of children who are sitting in the forest, but that doesn't even begin to put the questions around the fundamental structural causes that are at the bottom of this problem. And that's why I think Her Excellency's point is spot on in terms of what can be done. But I would also add just one little point, and that is that we tend to forget about our indigenous systems in Africa. If you look at just one issue around how solutions are found at the local community level, we have systems in place where people deal with problems that arise on a day-to-day basis, or problems that relate to differences between communities. They may be micro, but they actually work. So for example, take just local champions, local people who are revered, who people look up to, who they listen to. I think there isn't enough use of such local champions that can speak on behalf of the marginalized, the excluded, the vulnerable. And so we need to, when we look at the international movements that we need to have in bringing to action these political commitments, we also need to have a bottom-up approach that creates the demand for accountability, that creates the demand for dealing with the impunity, for the social injustice that happens. Thank you.
Spot on, spot on. So the question we always we deal with in meetings is there's lack of political will. And the question always is, who is political will? Where is political will? This political will is a very powerful person. The political will is in the masses, and when they evoke their agency, the authorities will move. The authorities will move. I hear you clearly, Cecilia. Cleophas, succinctly, your intervention.
In 5 seconds, Musa, I mean, I will pick up from where you've left about political will. And I think we need to shift, especially when we're talking about the Safe Schools Declaration. A lot of the focus has been on continental action to get endorsement from member states. We now need to shift that support, that advocacy to national level so that some of the issues that are being raised in the questions that are asked, they wouldn't be issues if the Safe Schools Declaration was both domesticated at national level and we had the proper monitoring mechanisms. So we need to have these partnerships with civil society organizations at country level, all the way to the grassroots, especially where we know we have active conflicts. So that, I mean, when you're talking about girls being made pregnant, for example, by armed forces, these are issues that can be addressed through the local justice system effectively. But since our actions are now mostly centered on the continental level and more geared towards having endorsement rather than implementation and reporting, that's why some of these things are seeping through the cracks while we still have this declaration. So my only push would be, let's now shift our attention to empowering CSOs, to empowering individuals, to empowering children at national level for the countries that have both endorsed or yet to endorse, to ensure that when this happens, the various monitoring mechanisms are in place and governments are able to implement and report on the same. And lastly, just as an overall reflection of today, we still stand by the fact that schools should be a safe space. It doesn't matter what the circumstance is, schools should be a safe space for children. It's a very important and formative stage for them, and we shall not relent from advocating for the same. Thank you very much, Dr. Musa. Over to you.
And Dr. Dennis called it safe sanctuaries. Schools should be safe sanctuaries. Colleagues, your indulgence, please, 5 more minutes to wrap up this. Ifeanyi, you have 2 minutes. I have seen another hand from Ekin. This is somebody who is speaking for the first time. Indulge me, colleagues, so that we can hear also the wisdom that Ekin is bringing. But you have 2 minutes, Ifeanyi.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Mine to Dorothy. Sorry. Okay. So mine to Dorothy. Dorothy, the people in charge of these problems are Education Cannot Wait Fund. They are the ones to integrate these children at the forest and give them education wherever they are. So you can write to them, and we should make a way that these international organizations can have access to people at the grassroots so they can report cases like that of Dorothy. So Dorothy, please look for Education Cannot Wait. Try and know if you can get a country representative and tell them about this problem. They are the ones to solve that problem. Thank you very much.
Spot on. Thank you so much. Ekin, you have the floor. 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you, sir. I just want to bring out some points. We are running a small NGO in Lebialem, where we have a community school, the Queen Fongan Foundation. So, and we all know Lebialem is in the Southwest region, which is highly attacked. So we are running a community school there, but we're finding it difficult to convince the children that they are being secured. Okay. When you convince them to come to school, some are coming and some are not coming because they are being afraid. So we have a problem of security. How do we convince these children that they are safe and secured? That is the problem we are having there. So please, somebody should help us on how, what factor can we give, what can we give to these children to really make them understand that no, this place is a secure place for them. Nobody is going to attack them. Thank you.
And indeed, again, the concerns of the children and their fears are legitimate because the president has shown that despite all the obligations that states have and the communities have towards the children, some of their colleagues have been abducted. And that's a serious challenge that I think we will not do justice to this topic today, certainly. But we'll still have the conversation continuing. Dr. Eddie, I'll hand over to you, I think, as we conclude. Over to you, Dr. Eddie.
Thank you very much, Dr. Musa, my brother Musa. I'd like to make 3 points without undermining any of the discussion. And my first point is a rhetorical question. And that is, what kind of person or group of people attack schools? In their own communities where their children and families live. This is a fundamental question that we need to address because they have a mindset. They do not have a mindset. In some ways, it is what you always call children not fit for Africa. And we need to create an Africa fit for children. So I think we need to continue to interrogate that question. How did we come to this situation? And that should form the basis of the conversations that we continue to have, because we must prevent our children who are currently in school from becoming those people. My second point is the Safe School Declaration in the context of UNCRC and the African Charter. I have no doubt in my mind that it provides a robust normative framework for action. But as we reflect on the Safe Schools Declaration and its adoption, I am touched by what one person said, that it must touch the people on the ground. And in touching the people on the ground, I offer 2 thoughts for doing that. One is that it must quickly move from being a normative framework that defines values into a regulatory framework that guides the way people behave. That's the first thing. And second, building on the big message that has come from this conversation, it might begin to change our mindset and the way we see schools to make them sanctuaries. So as we translate the Safe School Declaration to something that touches people, we must move from something that is normative into something that regulates behavior, into something that shapes our minds, because that's where sustainability comes from. Something that shifts our cognitive processes as well as the way we behave, our cultures. And the last point I want to make, Dr. Musa, is to thank His Excellency Nanima as well as Her Excellency Mushira, for the leadership that they are showing in this area. Because it's leadership, we need it. We need them to help us transform the minds and the actions of our people. And as I thank them for their leadership, I'm asking all of us to coalesce around them, to convene around them, to help them create a society and a movement that kicks out, that stops this thing that is undermining the development of our children of our continent. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come back, Musa.
Thank you, Dr. Eddie, as usual, for giving us small bites of things that we can concretely take forward in this regard. Tion, I see the joint statement that you have put in the chat box. I also recognize Mariam Mohammed's intervention. I think it's her despondency and concern over how unsafe schools are, how they are not a safe sanctuary for the children. Yeah, that's what we need to work on to make sure that they retain that value again. I think at this juncture, it is my honor to invite Honorable Dr. Nanima to close for us. Honorable Nanima, you have the floor.
Thank you once again, colleagues. I hope you can hear me. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it has been a great afternoon, and I continue to reiterate my appreciation on behalf of the committee and our partners, UNICEF, for honoring us with your presence. I also appreciate the tone of the conversation that we have had tonight. In equal measure, many thanks to the keynote speaker, and many thanks to everyone who has contributed through the insightful conversations that we have followed through voice and also via the chat box. I would like to say that, as correctly noted by the Honorable Special Rapporteur on Education, we need a stronger resolve not to spare our efforts. And where there is need for conflict resolution, there should also be peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. As the UNICEF representative to the AU, Dr. Adai, has also correctly stated, schools are central to the cognitive development of the child, and they offer a unique space for their holistic development. And the key ask is to engage in various initiatives, such as UNICEF's core commitment for children in humanitarian instances. Dr. Musavingana's overview on education under attack has extrapolated the magnitude of the problem, and he spoke to the fact that attacks on education require that one looks at the entire value chain and not just the institutions. In light of the numbers that he gave, he also called for the need for added security and the need for prosecution of perpetrators, addressing underlying issues of inequality, among others. The panel discussions by the various panelists have reiterated the magnitude of the problem, and they have created this nexus between the problem and the solution, which lies in the fact that we really need to have the endorsement of the Safe Schools Declaration. I agree with my colleague Ifenyi, who talked about the issue of dissemination, where we have to see that the dissemination of the declaration in our communities and to the children who are going to be the end users. I cannot add anything more, but I would also like to thank you and other stakeholders in different capacities. Without a shadow of doubt, I believe that this webinar has led to an awareness raising of the hotspots and emerging contexts where education is under attack. We have heard about issues in Central and Western Africa. I also believe that this has built the momentum towards the forthcoming fourth conference on the Safe Schools Declaration in Abuja, Nigeria, from the 25th to the 27th of October. I have no doubt that the endorsement and implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration is very critical to the realization of the mandate of the African Committee, and it's for this reason that we had this conversation. By way of concluding remarks in a few minutes, just allow me to latch on a few points and reiterate the committee's position on the way going forward. In terms of added value, the committee reiterates its commitment to interpreting the Charter in the positive light that engages the lived realities of the child in Africa The deliberate placement of this child in Africa at the center of all our interventions remains critical to ensuring that a child rights-based approach looks at their lived realities. We continue to use various working methods at our disposal, such as state party reporting, missions to state parties, using the communications procedure, conducting research, use of advocacy. And by way of this, we believe that our working with state parties, these approaches remain high on our agenda. They have spoken about jurisprudence from the committee, such as the general comment on Article 22, and also the model law on CAC, which I believe gives guidance to states on how they can engage with issues of children affected by armed conflict at a domestic level. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we remain committed to using this child rights-based approach, and we also remain committed to working with UNICEF and other stakeholders in ensuring that the provision of quality education is for every child in every environment in Africa. I cannot overemphasize your role as individuals, as CSOs, as NGOs, as national human rights institutions, as government offices, in your various communities to this cause. It begins with you doing something within the bounds of your habitation towards the protection of education from attack. I believe that to maintain our moral voice, we should not shy away from the violation, but to the end that the rights of the child are not only promoted, are not only protected, but seen to be promoted and seen to be protected. Once again, and on behalf of the committee, UNICEF, thanks so much, participants. Thanks so much, panelists, for honoring us with your presence. And a special vote of thanks to all of you. And I thank you and enjoy your day further. With those few remarks, I declare that the meeting is closed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Call to action. Take this down to your community. Thank you.